On my desk right now is the best Christmas present I've ever received. This is because my drum kit doesn't fit on my desk and I bought that one myself. Before me is a scale model of the Saturn V rocket designed to take astronauts from a launch pad in Cape Canaveral, Florida, to the surface of our only moon 238,900 miles away and bring them back without a scratch. On 17 incredible journeys, the Saturn series helped achieve the goal of landing a man on the moon. After Neil Armstrong stepped off Apollo 11 in 1969, the moon missions continued to garner data from the moon's surface until Eugene Cernan climbed into Apollo 17 and blasted off from the surface in 1972. Between them, 10 others also rode the tip of a Saturn V to an unexplored world. But how exactly does this monolithic spacefarer work? How does it not fall over? Where do the astronauts go to the bathroom? Today, I'd like to tell you about the culminated efforts of 400,000 men and women, 33 adrenaline junkies blasting off of our planet, and the spaceship that made it all possible. As the numeral would indicate, the Saturn V is not the first in its series. This is a Saturn I. Designed by German rocket scientist Wernher von Braun and his team, it stood at a towering 180 feet tall, weighing in at over 1.1 million pounds and held what's called a boilerplate or placeholder payload in lieu of the lunar lander. When NASA wanted to use the real thing, they realized that they needed to upgrade the already titanic thrust of over 1.5 million pounds of force that the rocket already produced. To give you a sense of scale, imagine designing a rocket with the capacity to put almost 2 full-size African elephants into orbit, and then deciding it needs to be even bigger. But that's what NASA did, and so they designed this, the Saturn 1B. Slightly beefier at 1.3 million pounds, the 1B doubled the payload capacity from 1.9 elephants to 3.5 elephants. But that seemed mean to the elephants, so they sent people instead. Specifically, it sent Apollo 7's crew of Walter Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walter Cunningham into low Earth orbit, commonly referred to as LEO, which was the first crewed flight since Apollo 1's tragic explosion several years prior. This would be the first and last manned Apollo flight it saw, but the 1B has ferried satellites and other payloads into orbit in the years since. That little platform the rocket sits on is called a milk stool, and was used to make up for the height difference between the 1B and the 5 when it's connected to the launch tower. This brings us to the AS500 series, or as we know it today, the Saturn V. It absolutely dwarfs the 1 and 1B at 363 feet tall and 6.5 million pounds when fueled and ready to launch. It could send 310,000 pounds to LEO and 107,100 pounds into a lunar orbit. Ever wanted to land 8 elephants on the moon? With the Saturn V, your dream could become reality. Now that we've uncovered its origins, what makes this lunar behemoth so special? A major reason why NASA switched to the 5 for lunar missions is that it could send payload to the moon, something that the other rockets just weren't powerful enough to do. The main body of the rocket consists of 3 stages, each with a specific purpose, combined together with the Apollo capsule at the top. Stage 1 was the largest, as it had to push a fully fueled rocket up and away from the Earth. It managed to take it 42 miles above sea level before it ran out of fuel. Explosives were used to separate the stages from each other very carefully so as not to ignite the fuel. Stage 2 took the rocket almost to orbit until breaking off of Stage 3, which carried it into a circular 100-mile-high orbit. At launch, all of the stages are put together like this. Each stage has several engines as well as individual fuel tank. No, these aren't car engines with oils and pistons. They're rocket engines spraying combusting gas together to provide thrust. The gas is stored in the tanks marked LOX, which stands for liquid fuel and oxygen. Since there's no air in space to aid in combustion, they have to bring their own for both the rockets and the astronauts. That brings us to the Apollo capsule on the very top, made of the service, lunar, and command modules. The launch escape system on the very top does exactly that. If something goes wrong, the astronauts hit a button that disengages every single stage, fires the solid rocket fuel on top, and flies away from the presumably exploding rocket behind them. The command module is where the astronauts ate, slept, piloted, and lived during their journey. It was connected directly to the service module, which carried fuel, oxygen, and other necessities up until it separated for re-entry. These are referred together as the Command and Service Module, or CSM. This, along with the lunar module, went to the moon, although only the lunar module touched down. You might expect that, since the Command and Service modules flew together, connected, the lunar lander was also attached to them as well, right? Wrong. Because the astronauts were at the tip of the rocket, NASA had to stage the engine behind the CSM, which meant the lunar module had to go on the other end of the rocket, or the very top. Since that's where they had to put the LEM in order to get the astronauts out, the engineers were in a pickle. One early suggestion was to make the entire Apollo craft land on the moon at once, but that would take way too much fuel to land and then come back up to orbit again because of the weight involved. Their ingenious solution? send up the lunar module separately on the same Saturn V and dock in flight, using a maneuver called transposition and docking. Here's how it works. Stage 2 boosts the craft towards LEO until Stage 3 takes over and circularizes the orbit. It then performs what's known as a translunar injection, firing the rockets on one side of the orbit to fall around the Earth and eventually slow down enough to orbit the Moon in the opposite direction it orbited the Earth. Orbital mechanics is complicated and outside of the scope of today's presentation, so we'll move on to the next step of the maneuver, transposition. The CSM shed the LEM and its fairings, which are covers designed to keep the lunar module safe from atmospheric forces. As seen before, the lunar module is situated behind the others, so the CSM now has to turn around to dock from the front. Over the course of an hour of the 3-day lunar injection, they slowly drifted towards the lunar module, eventually sliding a cone-shaped connector into the module to guide the docking app into place. Once the module was securely connected, Stage 3 disconnected while small translation engines pushed the modules away. Ground controls remotely piloted Stage 3 away so it wouldn't hit the craft, and the now completed spacecraft continued its journey. Over the next few days, Apollo would land on the Moon, take off again, and return to Earth laden with scientific data, cool rocks, and 3 men who hadn't showered in a week. But the Saturn V didn't. Stage 1 and 2 mostly burned up in orbit, and what didn't is lost beneath the sea. Stage 3 flew the farthest, and eventually entered a solar orbit so as not to hit Apollo. Apollo gets all the credit, but in telling the story, I wanted to tell of the unsung hero of the journey. I think astronaut Michael Collins, pilot of the CSM on Apollo 11, put it best. While still in space awaiting re-entry, he said this on a television broadcast to millions below. The Saturn V rocket which put us in orbit is an incredibly complicated piece of machinery, every piece of which worked flawlessly. We have always had confidence that its equipment would work properly. All this is possible only through the blood, sweat, and tears of a number of people. All you see is the 3 of us, but beneath the surface are thousands and thousands of others, and to all of those I would like to say, thank you very much. He and 33 other men put their faith into an explosion-powered Titan that propelled them into the unknown, and for that, I too say, thank you very much.